Hello, everybody. Come on in. Say hello. I know the insiders know the drill. My name is Justin Rivers. I am the Chief Experience Officer with Untapped New York, welcoming you to a virtual visit to the Queens Museum. We are very lucky to get an inside look at the new exhibits that the Queens Museum has up. As a lot of you know, the Queens Museum is a favorite place of mine and of Untapped New York's, featured on our World's Fair tour, both virtual and in person. And today we are very lucky to have with us two of the assistant curators at the Queens Museum, Sophia Lucas and Lindsay Burfond, who will be talking us through each of the two new exhibits, also giving us a little bit of great background on the museum itself. So I'm going to say hello to some folks, and then I am going to turn it over. I believe I'm turning it over to Lindsay first. So hi, Robin from the Cold Wet Berkshires. Hello from Justin is in St. Louis, but although, as you can see, I am Nicole, and Nicole is me today because I am jumping off after intros to do a private virtual tour. So Nicole will be back facilitating Q&A at the end. Jeffrey Bernard, welcome from the Upper West Side. Cynthia from Baltimore, Nancy from Tuckahoe. Yes, Robin, the panorama. Mary from Alexandria. Sylvia from Woodside, Queens. Hello, Richard from sunny Florida. Howie from New Jersey by way of Brooklyn. I always say we're the reverse, Howie. Seth from Jersey City. Joe from windy London. Oh, it's windy today. Pete from San Francisco. Tom from Atlanta. Hello, hello, everybody. I hope that you enjoy this presentation. As I said, Queens Museum, one of my top 5 in New York. Without further ado, I turn it over to Lindsay. Go for it.
Thank you, Justin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and get started alongside my colleague, Sophia Marisa Lucas, who's here with me. And we're going to start just with a context to let you know kind of where we are. And then we're going to go straight into talking about some of our 2 temporary exhibitions. So here we see the Queens Museum on the park side of the building. We are located in Flushing Meadows Park in Queens, which is a truly, truly alive, as you can see, well-utilized space. Even so during the pandemic, the backyard really for so many families that live in our surrounding neighborhoods. And the Queens Museum itself is really, at its core, a community engaged and artist-centered contemporary art museum, but it's also a historical site. In the work that we do, we really strive to have our programs informed by the local communities that surround us to best serve the borough. We organize exhibitions, we do education initiatives and public events. But as I said, we're also a historical site. So we're home to artifacts and archival materials from the 1939 and 1964 World's Fairs, which were hosted throughout the park on our site, as well as in the Queens Museum historic building. Yeah, so, you know, the building that the museum currently inhabits was first built for the 1939 World's Fair, where it served as the New York City Pavilion. The theme of the fair that year in 1939 was the world of tomorrow. And as you can see on the left, some of the kind of most iconic architectural bits of that fair was the iconic Trilon and Perisphere structures you can see at the center, which were kind of very close proximity to the museum building. And this theme, as well as like these architectural structures that we see, were all about the future, right? To convey a utopia of the future, attempting almost to stir hope, right? At a moment that was kind of sandwiched between the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II. And then on the right, you can see the Queens Museum was repurposed in 1946 following that 1939 World's Fair as the temporary home of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And you can see the outside kind of with all the nation's flags. And this was really, you know, a critical time in the United Nations. A number of really major decisions were made during this moment, including, of course, the Declaration of Human Rights, which is something I think as curators we come back to quite a bit in our work. And then, of course, as Justin was saying in the beginning, the iconic panorama, which is really the heart of the museum. And this was, so again, basically after the United Nations, the museum was repurposed once again as the New York City Pavilion for the 1964 World's Fair, which had the theme of peace through understanding. Here we can see the panorama of the city of New York, which was presented for the fair in the building. It's a model of New York City's 5 boroughs, a scale model that's still on view. We really consider this not only as an artifact, right? It was last updated in 1992. It was completed in 94. But as like a marker of how we consider these systems of urban development, of urban planning, the structures that make our landscape and impact the communities that we serve in the borough, right? So it kind of reverberates out from this artifact to be something more in the work we do as we engage it. And it's one of the most well-known attractions of the museum.
Yeah, I would just add to that.
Yeah, Sophia.
To that, you know, one of the like perpetual questions and quirks about the panorama is, you know, what is it? Is it an artifact, or is it a living tool as it was intended, and what should it become? And I think what's interesting about it is it's a kind of hybrid object now. As Lindsay said, it was updated with a complete update of the city in 1992 to 1994. And since then, certain areas have been updated, namely by large developers who can purchase their own models to be added to the panorama. So it really also encodes like the dynamics around urban development and the privatization of it in a really compelling and confusing way.
Absolutely. And yeah, something that we come back to when we bring artists, when we bring cultural workers into the museum, it's always a conversation to talk about. And, you know, the panorama is definitely one of the most iconic, second only to, of course, the Unisphere from the 1964 fair that's just outside our building. Sophia and I, as curators, often working with artists who are activating these structures in very unique ways. Marinella Senatore presented a symphony, LGBTQ symphony, in front of the Unisphere in 2017. So it's the kind of ways in which the park becomes super active when we work with artists. And then, of course, you know, so a lot of what I've shown before is pre-pandemic. So much has changed for all of us during this time. And what you're looking at here is a facade work as of September of this past year, 2020, facing the Grand Central Parkway side of the museum. And this is a public artwork by an artist named Meryl Laderman-Ukeles, whose large-scale survey Sophia incredibly worked on in 2016. And we're working with her again. And, you know, you might know Meryl best from her practice focusing on working with maintenance and sanitation workers, as well as her 40-year role as the official unsalaried artist in residence at the Department of Sanitation in New York. So this piece is both a response to the pandemic and a real continuation of Meryl Laderman-Ukeles' long-sitting dedication to honoring the labor of New York City public service workers. And the facade reads, as you can see, "Dear service worker, thank you for keeping New York City alive for forever." And it's part of a larger, just so you know, this is at our site at Queens Museum. It was part of a larger public art initiative that was presented as well with Times Square Arts and MTA Arts and Design. So we have the graphic here in the museum facade, as well as the piece was on view in a large-scale digital billboard in Times Square and across digital displays throughout the MTA subway and rail system. So also, as we are navigating the pandemic and its impact on our communities at Queens Museum, we started with the La Jornada, a food pantry at Queens Museum, in collaboration with La Jornada, which is an incredible food bank based out of Flushing, and at Queens Museum, we host a weekly food distribution program that began in June 2020, providing increased food security to our immediate neighbors in the 11368 zip code. Corona, Queens, as many of you know who are local, was really the epicenter of the first wave of the pandemic, and the largely immigrant communities that are living in Corona continue to face devastating loss and food insecurity, mostly due to unemployment and, of course, unequal access to resource and government assistance. So the work we're doing weekly is on Wednesdays at the La Jornada Food Pantry, and we serve about an average of 600 families at the pantry. And also our work continues, both launching as our world has changed, right? The museum is responding in different ways. So the Year of Uncertainty is a program I really encourage you to check out on our website. It's a new framework that launched this winter with the goal of strengthening the connection among the museum, our communities, and our constituents. And it's centered around a few themes that I think are continuous things we come back to. The themes are care, repair, play, justice, and the future. And we're really trying to become a center for learning and production around these themes and collaboration, really. We have a big cohort of Year of Uncertainty participants, which includes 6 artists in residence, 9 community partners from across the Queens Borough, and 12 artists, designers, scientists, writers, and activists who've been invited as co-thinkers to rethink the shape of the museum this year with us. So we really encourage you to keep an eye out, particularly this fall, when more of this project will launch. All right, well, I am going to get started talking about a particular exhibition that just opened at the museum this past March. We, of course, we are doing responsive programming, but we've also continued our QM Jerome Foundation Emerging Artist Fellowship Program with the 2019 to 2020 fellows now finally getting their exhibitions up. And those fellows are Asif Mian and Sydney Shen, and their culminating exhibitions are now both on view. As part of this program, 2 New York City-based artists received $20,000 each, professional development from our team, and a culminating exhibition at the museum, of course. So today I'll be speaking about Asif Mian's exhibition, RAF Prosthetic Location, but I also highly encourage you to visit the museum to see Sydney Shen's exhibition titled Strange But True, curated by my amazing colleague here, Sophia Marisa Lucas. The show just opened last week, so it's very, very new. So I'm gonna get started by bringing up a video. Hold on. Okay. Excellent. Here we go. So this is going to give you a little bit of a walkthrough as if you're in the galleries with us. So RAF Prosthetic Location is part of the artist Asif Mian's ongoing multi-chapter project RAF, which explores how we are impacted by violence and its perception. When Mian was about 20 years old, his estranged father was killed in Terrell, Texas by RAF, which is an alias that the artist has created for the still unidentified suspect who committed this murder. In RAF, Mian has created what he calls a living ghost based on the limited description of the eyewitnesses. The description was male, dark complexion, wearing a red plaid shirt, shoulder-length hair, escaping in a green pickup truck on Interstate 20 in Texas. And Prosthetic Location kind of adapts the format of a behavioral science case study to create a profile of RAF, who this person was that Asif has created. And while the narrative unfolding in Prosthetic Location surrounds one single event, it's really not as a static occurrence. It's something that Asif is returning to as a continuum of interpretations, reenactments, reverberations. And while RAF's identity exists in the gaps of witness testimony, the artwork that Asif is creating, really fills in and augments that character description in the sculpture, textile, drawing, and video. And he uses a lot of lenses to do that, right? He uses the tools of forensics, teenage psychology, genetics, which he did his undergrad studies in, as well as kind of tropes of masculinity, this toxic masculinity. And as well as he uses the themes of science fiction and transformation and shape-shifting. So I'm gonna go back to my presentation. All right. Yep. Excellent. Yeah, so layered within this exhibition with this profile that the artist is creating of this figure of Raft is really a web, right, of fragmented facts and fictions that also combine not only like who we're speculating Raft is, but also the artist's own history at the time of his father's death. So for the artist, it really is like combining Raft and himself as a form of investigative therapy, kind of processing these forces that haunt him and kind of leaning into them as he's working through them. And what I'm showing here is really at the beginning of the exhibition, what you see when you first walk in and you look up, and is really indicative of the way Mian's work is an investigation into the psychological roots and inherited culture of violence that we inhabit here in the United States. So in this entryway, we see the hood of the green pickup truck I talked about earlier with chrome trim, what Raft was last seen driving as he escaped the scene of the crime. And under this truck hood, Asif has arranged swaths of red plaid shirts, what Raft was last seen wearing, in the shape of kind of a Rorschach ink blot. And this particular ink blot is often interpreted by patients to symbolize the father. And of course, what Asif is doing is he's reversing here the emblem, that you'll often see on the front of cars, like an American flag or an eagle, and place it underneath the car, underneath the surface, these acts of violence that exists. And here we work further into the exhibition. I'm going to focus on the left on the vitrine and small pieces on the wall. So again, in Asif's work, as he's reacting to kind of this investigative mode, he's dissecting, measuring, and magnifying evidence that he's been able to recover. And this can be seen in these small works. On the wall in particular, and the detail on the right, you can see the works he calls 1 inch of separated red and black plaid, in which the artist is really physically pulling apart an inch of plaid fabric in this super almost strenuous way. And he uses very different versions of the plaid shirt that Raft was reported to wearing, because it could be any type of red plaid, right? There are hundreds of variations on it. And then inside the vitrine, there are copies of the 6 eyewitness reports that Asif recovered that are rendered on fabrics and pierced by trajectory rods. And these rods, the brightly colored neon ones, are often used to illustrate the direction of a bullet in a crime scene. And what Mian does, as you can see, particularly in the work on the image on the bottom right, is he's traced over the handwriting of each of the detectives who were doing the reporting, effectively kind of redacting the content of some of the testimony. And the text comes kind of in and out of visibility based on the materiality of what he's used. The fabric he's used. The letters kind of seep into silk in the black and white, but they're also silkscreen on top of the fabric or even burned out of the velvet. The textures are really diverse. And in this, as we move further into the exhibition, the video on the left is called Sedated Snake. It's a performance that was created in response to Asif looking at the genre of YouTube fight videos, where Mian and his collaborator are kind of transforming what is normally an act of aggression, an altercation that has a lot of pain and struggle. And they're slowing it down to the point where this struggle, as they move around the ground, becomes a caress, almost an embrace between 2 bodies. And these bodies in motion are also conceptually linked to the sculpture. You can see on the pedestal here. And this sculpture is called Smokeless Fire, CG Jin. And that shows, again, Raft's plaid shirts, jeans, as well as these flame textiles that are morphing in space, right? Almost like moving like the 2 bodies engaged in a fight. And this jinn that Asif's talking about is tied to Islamic mythology, where jinn are often seen as these kind of treacherous and definitely invisible supernatural life forms that can inhabit other human beings. And according to the Quran, they form from a smokeless fire where the physical and metaphysical come together. And this work, this sculpture in particular, is really demonstrating something that's throughout the exhibition, how the force of a jinn of violence might behave, right? The way a djinn of violence might possess Raf's body and build upon Asif's research into visual representations of the djinn. He's taking a lot from miniature paintings, Persian miniature paintings, as well as kind of computer-generated art, graphics and science fiction as well to make this piece. And then as we move more into the show, we have this really pocket of including 2 very large-scale carpet works. We can see November 25th, vestiges of memory here in a detail where debris from Raf's story is embedded into the surface of a carpet, a synthetic carpet. And that includes a mosaic of tiles that you can see here that recall both kind of the arabesque patterns that you might see in a mosque, as well as the cartographic outline of a neighborhood seen from above. I often see like the blocks, the city blocks kind of formed when looking at this from above from this angle. And the rug becomes a map. It becomes an archaeological site. It becomes an emotional landscape kind of all in one. And under the platform, when you're in the space, which I highly encourage you to visit, you hear basically the deep sound of the artist humming, and this just under the surface. And this audio kind of stems from Mian's daily practice of meditation, which has been a big part of his personal recovery process, looking at the healing power of vibration in the aftermath of violence. And we're going to briefly look at the kind of 2 works on the wall, which have on the top right, you can see a forensic ruler pattern, what's often used in investigation to really measure and photograph evidence with the accuracy needed to reconstruct scenarios. So again, Asif deconstructing this event. And in this blue framed work, it's almost like a glitch-like patterning with different pieces of evidence that we see elsewhere in the exhibition too that were used to identify Raf. And then there's also this work next to it, Real Men Wear Black, which is informed by Asif's own experiences as a teenage athlete, as well as a biogenetics student in his undergrad. So again, we see the artist's kind of method of these surgically separating these threads of red plaid, but he's doing so in a kind of outline of what looks like a scientific model for virus transmission. That's what he was taking the shapes from. So really, again, what he's looking at is, how has Raf inherited trauma and violence genetically, but also looking at the associations with this abstracted Raiders logo of the ties between sports prowess and hypermasculinity. The Raiders are kind of known for rough play, as I've heard in sports, in football. So I just want to talk briefly about the second carpet in the exhibition, this very large scale carpet titled The Meeting of Raf and Jinn. So here, Asif is doing something he's done before in past works, but really expanding it, which is adapting the imagery of handmade Afghan carpets. These carpets traditionally depict narratives tied to the land, animals, plant life, and spiritual figures to represent the characters in Raf's story. So you can see this long, skinny jinn figure moving towards a 2-headed Raf, which is image all the way on the right here. And what Asif has done is he's really spliced together this Afghan carpet made in Pakistan with this American synthetic carpet. And you can see in the details on the right how embedded they are into one another, almost like 2 pieces in a puzzle, which he considers akin to kind of genetic recombination again, to create this folkloric pattern, new folkloric pattern. And this is the last part of the exhibition that I'll talk about, where we have works in video and sculptural installation that continue to adjust the profile of Raf and the physical conditioning of violence through perceived traits of hypermasculinity or the alpha male. In Chop Shop, which is these sculptures on the ground here, Raf's truck is again reconstructed as a ghostly reflection made from fusing weightlifting equipment, which is very forcefully welded together with rims, car stands, and an exhaust system. And they're very slickly chromed after they've been combined to these hybrid sculptures that almost extend out from this space into this mirror that recall a mirror-filled high school gym or even a hot road mirage. So the kind of what we might see on a hot day on the highway in Texas. And here are some details you can see of how the piece is put together. And then lastly, These two works take cues from depictions of aliens in science fiction. The piece above is a cut open HVAC duct titled Shifter. And the work is, again, a manifestation of Raph as a non-human and this undetectable force that's the host for a Jinn figure. So you see them taking the form of a chromed liquid metal bursting through an overhead air vent. And below teenager, here are some details of that. And then below teenager is really, again, a dream narrative that Asif is creating in a world where sweating is illegal. He's using something he's used before, which is these thermal cameras that are used to kind of surveil and police people in this video work. So, he's really demonstrating that while science fiction may be present in dystopian narratives, in reality, the tendency towards violence is already living within and around us. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sophia. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was amazing. Just gonna load up my presentation here. So, actually, it was quite interesting that as Kenneth Tam's project emerged, Silent Spikes, and Asif received the fellowship, there was a lot of kind of kinship and ideas, and so you'll see common threads as I speak. But first, I'll introduce Ken. Kenneth Tam was born and raised in Queens, not far from the Queens Museum, and currently lives and works in Brooklyn. For the past several years, he has been producing moving image works and sculptures that negotiate and disrupt conceptions of group identity and the performance of gender. Working with male participants, Ken's video works document a wide array of loosely scripted interactions and self-expressive acts that explore hidden channels and untapped possibility for intimacy. So as a bit of an illustration of that work, I wanted to start with two previous examples. This is a still from a video called Sump, where Ken on the left is performing a series of wordless rituals with his father on the right. And this is just, exploring a kind of tension between their generational gap, the intimacy or the lack thereof between father and son. And then this is an installation view of a work called Olive M. This is at Sculpture Center, also in Queens, a great institution. And it's now in the collection of the Guggenheim. But this is a video work in which Ken worked with folks he didn't know, participants that he solicited to be part of this kind of collective process to reimagine the high school prom. This is another example of a kind of intergenerational exchange where there are actual high school seniors exploring the social rituals of the prom, and with adults reflecting back on their experience of the prom to kind of to consider ways to enact new rituals in this very constricted performance of male identity that is the prom, or gendered identity that is the prom. And then also in this image, you see an example of how Ken uses sculpture. So these inner tubes are filled with sand. They function in the video as props. And here, Ken has rendered larger versions of those as sculptures in the installation. And they're meant to have these very ambiguous forms that can read as easily as a bodily surrogate or a punching bag. And now, so Ken's most recent work, Silent Spikes, which we commissioned, kind of intersects this probing of gender expression and group dynamics with a more explicit address of race, social position, and labor economics. The work departs from a specific history, an under-recognized history of the building of the western portion of the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, which took place from 1863 to 1869 and was owed primarily to Chinese immigrants. So I'm going to move through a few slides of the gallery and also show a walkthrough video. So what you saw in the last image was kind of the view as you enter the gallery. This gallery has a very long, narrow, kind of tunnel-like entryway, actually. And once you emerge, you see the first sculptural form, and then it's a 2-channel video, as you see here, and then another sculpture at the end of the gallery. It's a very minimalist installation, but a very central, centering the 20-minute video within it.
Sophie, you might just want to mute yourself when the video is playing.
So this is a view from the other end of the gallery where you can kind of see that entryway. And the irregular formation of the wall on the left in this image is actually conforming to the shape of the panorama. And you can see at the far left that this is an entrance to the panorama. This is the Manhattan side. Some of you might be familiar with that. And I will return to the panorama, I promise, later. But first, more about the work. So as I mentioned, this history, the building of the western portion of the railroad, it's really an intertwined history of westward expansion and immigration in the U.S. 20,000 Cantonese immigrants were workers on this western portion of the railroad, which was the most treacherous. And this is a still from the video, which shows the tunnel that actually had to be burrowed by hand in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And the title Silent Spikes comes from a text that Ken encountered about this history from a former professor of American history at the Beijing Normal University in China. And the term silent spikes is a reference to railroad spikes, large nails that are used to secure tracks, but refer to, in this case, the marginalized or silenced Chinese laborers without whom the railroad would not have been completed. For Tam, the idea of spike also suggests their power, even in the face of exploitation, as they perform this really incredible feat. What you're seeing here is some of the work that Ken did in this video with his performers. So over a series of multiple sessions, Ken worked in this loosely scripted format, as he normally does, with all self-identifying Asian American males of all different backgrounds, local to New York. And the process was intended to kind of acknowledge and contend with this history, and specifically to explore how movement and connection can create space to honor selfhood and transcend trauma in the body, and in a collective practice, how that can create new forms of connection that might sit outside some formalized construction like Asian Americanness, which one might not readily self-identify with or be able to define as a more kind of embodied and social experience. So Ken did work with a choreographer, and what you're seeing here is two of the participants in a black box theater, and they kind of alternated performing certain expressive gestures and recording one another. while Ken also recorded them. And so within the video, it's a combination of this footage, these activations with participants, and found footage, as well as this kind of dramatic narrative reenactment of the history itself. And within the two channels, these sources of footage kind of shift and overlap and merge in really interesting ways that kind of collapse time and collapse subjectivities. I'll show you another image here. So this is an image of a performer, a trained performer who's kind of doing an interpretive dance along with a narration in Cantonese of a personal history that Ken scripted himself based on his research and, you know, his notion of what the lives of these workers would have been like. And here's another, this is a 2-channel view. At times the images will sync and at times they won't. And so, you know, for Ken, the focus was really on this as a kind of redemptive possibility, like to resurrect not only this history and make it more visible, but also to recognize one particular aspect of the history, which was a strike that happened in 1867, where 3,000 of the workers halted their work, fighting against the work conditions and their lower wages. And in connecting with a contemporary group of Asian American males, and allowing them to kind of engage poetically with this history, the hope was that we can kind of redeem cultural constructions and trauma that are perpetuated by dominant narratives. And the video is very cinematic, as I mentioned, and I think the style of the video is not only a response to this history, but also responds to the stereotyped representation of Asian American males in media, particularly in Western films. So this figure of the cowboy comes in as this archetype that, you know, is not only relevant to this history, but actually still looms large in our culture as this kind of paragon of masculinity in America. And I just want to share a little clip of a video where Ken talks about this aspect himself.
And enacting a sort of resistance to a kind of hegemonic sort of capitalist system.
So you can see that this kind of gesture of complication, of kind of assuming what one is kind of marginalized against as a way to own it and transform it for oneself, is carried into the way Ken created these hybrid sculptures, which incorporate as in the earlier example I showed, prop from the video, which is the saddle, as well as some of the costume elements. I'm returning to the panorama. So this is an image of the Queen's Museum, the segment of Flushing Meadows Corona Park that we occupy with the Unisphere, and the New York State Pavilion, which is also still existing from the '64 World's Fair. And then on the right, a little map showing where the Queen's Museum is in relation to the terminus of the 7 train in Flushing. And I include this because this was a kind of early conversation that Ken and I had about the work and its relevance to the Queen's Museum specifically. We're one stop before at Metz Willits, and the 7 train is such an important vehicle for all of the immigrant communities throughout Queens to go into Manhattan and work. And so, and of course, Flushing, which is a predominantly East Asian community, there was this kind of uncanny kind of thinking about the train and this kind of reversal of who it's for. But still complicated dynamics in terms of social status and labor economics and all of that. So in thinking about this, I also thought back to earlier in the 1939 World's Fair, which, as Lindsay mentioned, was developed in the midst of the Great Depression and just before the World War. And it was this opportunity to kind of encourage economic growth and utilization of the railroad, among other things. So there was a whole area of the fair called the transportation zone. And then there was this railroad building, which is pictured here. This is the west facade. And additionally, there was a really elaborate live action performance with rail cars of Through the Ages, moving, choreographed to song, and as a retelling of the building of the railroad. Of course, this retelling comes from the perspective of, familiar major political figures and their intersections with railroad developments, as well as familiar, players in the golden age and the industrial capitalist boom of that period, and which very much the World's Fair is sought to kind of continue in further as a narrative through their emphasis on innovation and a kind of endless positivity around progress. And then I include this little, so this is a poster, of course, promoting, but I include this little excerpt here because there's also a very interesting gendered reading of the railroad and the terrain that the pavilion and this performance put forth. So Railroads on Parade records the magnificent progress of the past 110 years. It begins with the first efforts of men who, inspired with bold vision and foresight, worked to achieve, and it leads to a glowing picture of railroad operation in the United States in 1939. It is the backbone of the country. No, even more, it is its veritable lifeblood. And you can kind of read the rest there. But I came across in the program for Railroads of Parade these drawings, which are sketches of murals that actually appear on the building. So this is the image that was on the facade of the building in that postcard, the west facade. And there's such a kind of strong formal language here that aligns the female form with the curvature of the landscape and the male form with the kind of rectilinear form of the train. And this kind of undeniably almost violent gendered imagery just felt like a very kind of interesting and fertile backdrop for Ken's project as well. And then, as I mentioned, Ken's a key inspiration for Ken with this project was thinking through the power of resistance and resurrecting stories of resistance that are overshadowed. And another instance of this is the core protests, which happened at the 1964 World's Fair, where almost no Blacks or Latinos were hired to help with the construction of the fair. And it was despite the fact that it was one of the largest publicly funded construction projects in the city to date. So I will end on that very sad note, but we're excited to take questions from you.
A note of resistance.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you, Lindsay and Sophia. If anybody has any questions, definitely go ahead and drop those in the chat or in the questions tab. I'll keep an eye on both of those as you drop those in there. Just want to give a shout out to Robin and her dad, Richard Roth. Robin noted that her dad was instrumental in the 1990 update of the panorama and actually placed one of the buildings that he designed on there. So shout out to you guys who are always at all of our talks as well. And I just want to let people know how long will the exhibits be on view until, and when can they come visit the Queen's Museum?
Yeah, so Ken's installation is on view until June 23rd, and the Asif's, I'm not going to remember the exact dates.
July 25th, just
July
about a
25th.
month after is when Asif's exhibition closes.
And the museum is open Wednesday through Sunday, Wednesday through Friday, 12 to 5, and then Saturday and Sunday, 11 to 5. And of course, we have limited capacity at this point, but we have a huge capacity. So actually, it's not an issue. So folks can reserve tickets online. And if they just show up, they're also likely to be admitted very easily.
Awesome.
And it's free.
Yes. Perfect. All right. I don't see any questions yet, but if anybody has any, definitely go ahead and drop those in the chat. We have a few minutes here. I love the presentation. I wish I got to come to the Queen's Museum when I was just in New York. But I'm just always impressed with how all the different layers of the art installations and how it touches on so many parts of history and the current day. And with these two artists, especially how they work in different mediums, I think that's so impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I think just it's a really inspiring and challenging space to work with. You know, like the panorama is the heart of the museum, and we are always trying to kind of honor the history that represents, but also the building itself and the layers of activations of that building in the past, but also figure out meaningful ways to complicate that and bring new relevance and to our surrounding communities, the broader public today. So it's always a joy to work with artists who are kind of interested and inspired by those histories. Yeah, especially when they're like right in our community too. So.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say, and they're local artists as well. That's also awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Looks like we have a question here from Seth Lubin. So you guys kind of mentioned this before. This is a question about the panorama. How often is it updated?
Yeah. So it's the intention when Robert Moses had it built was for it to be continuously updated. And what we didn't mention is like the idea, the New York City Pavilion, which is our building, was built for the 39 World's Fair. It's the only surviving building, and it was pretty much in continuous use. We highlighted the kind of notable uses of the General Assembly and the two World's Fairs, but it was meant to be a kind of public space, recreation center, and also the panorama was meant to always be situated in there as a tool for urban planners like Robert Moses himself. And so that was his intention. It didn't actually sort of happen that way. And when the museum took over in 1972, there was an update. And then in 1992, there was another update. And kind of in between and since, there have only been special cases of individual builders and developers purchasing their own models of their buildings or structures and having them installed on the panorama. So this is both like a challenging thing and also something that can be sort of inspiring. I think that, you know, of course, a lot of people come to the museum and they see the Twin Towers and they're a little kind of startled or confused. And that becomes like a starting point for like, well, when is this from? And, you know, what does it represent? But also other things that stand out to me when I look at it is, you know, all of the public housing is in a certain shade of red that's only for that housing. It's a very color-coded object. And to see how much there was still in 1992 versus what there is now. So, you know, it's a very generative object in its kind of complex atemporality. And seeing that in contrast to these like very, you know, the new developments are also made in different materials, right? So they really, really stand out. You know, they're like fiberglass and, you know, glow in certain lights and like, you know, against these little tiny like paper and wood hand painted structures from the original panorama and from its updates. So, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting, unique object. Okay, and then this question comes from Joe. Is there more that you could say about the Year of Uncertainty program?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we spoke about, I think the Year of Uncertainty is a work in progress. It's happening as we speak. You know, we are really in the process of just working, you know, I encourage you to visit our website to learn more about each of the artists in residence, as well as working with community partners who do really community organizing for the most part across so many different communities in the borough, tackling so many different topics that are forefront of our mind around a lot of the themes that we're talking about, like justice and care, repair. So it's really like, you know, I would say more, but a lot of that work is happening between all of these cohort members and partners. And we're hoping that these collaborations between artists, between community organizers kind of become something really generative that we're excited to kind of launch in September, in the fall. But it's also like a way for us to kind of take our work as a museum and kind of put the internal, external, to put it out. And so the hope is that when you visit the museum, you know, in the fall, you'll see kind of works in progress that are still happening kind of as we're exhibiting them. So yeah, I think the more we can say about the Year of Uncertainty will probably be like each of the artists and incredible community groups and co-thinkers that are listed on our website. So I encourage you to check that out. It'll give you a really sense of the breadth of the program.
Awesome, yeah, and Justin had dropped a link to that page specifically in the chat. I also dropped a link to Sydney Shen's exhibit that's also going on, and I'm going to drop a link now for where you can reserve your tickets to visit and check out the hours to make sure the museum is open. Let's see, one more question popped up here. This one comes from Tom Reed. Did Robert Moses see it as a model that would be updated or more of a snapshot? So going back to the panorama again.
Yeah, it was the idea was that it would be an active tool. You know, I mean, he saw the entire fair as, you know, a stamping of his legacy and the panorama central to that, and he wanted to leave it to other urban developers. I mean, it's kind of it's almost a little sinister when you think about it. You know, the bird's eye view that we can have of the city that way, and to imagine urban planners going, well, we can just move that piece there. We can just get rid of that whole area there. But of course, that's how, you know, that's how cities are planned with models. But the kind of private-public aspect of it is really interesting. And to kind of be exposed or conscious of the process that normally happens behind closed doors. I don't know what he thought of that, what his idea around that was, but it sparks imagination for sure. But yeah, that was his intention. It just didn't exactly happen that way. There was a, you know, it was used as a recreation space. The panorama was taken out for a period. There was an ice skating rink and a roller skating rink in the panorama area. And so it was eventually brought back, as I mentioned, when the museum opened in 1972. It's been there since.
Great.
Yeah, now when we think about urban planning, we're often thinking about digital tools as well, right? So like the way when we think about like this as like a pre-Google Maps, right? I mean, I think it's urban planning has also evolved in that framework as well.
But no less problematic.
Right.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you, Sophia, for hosting us today and giving us this very inside look of the amazing exhibits on view. I hope that everybody who joined us today gets a chance to go see it in person. I'll be back in New York over the summer, so I'll have to make it a point to come visit. Thanks everyone for joining us. As Justin mentioned at the top, insiders are joining this and all of our virtual tours for free, starting at just $10 a month. There's a link at the top to join, and I didn't prepare what's coming up. Let's see what's coming up next week. I know we have a tour of the SS Columbia, one of the oldest steamships still left, and then we also have free tickets to the Waterfront Conference. You can check out how you can get those on the Insiders website, and then also we have a talk of the Forgotten Movie Palaces of the Bronx coming up as well. Very exciting stuff coming up. We hope to see you all again soon. And once again, thanks so much to the Queens Museum and Lindsay and Sophia.
Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.